yeah, like you said, like I mean, the fatherlessness issue has become. It goes back to the very issue of okay. I mean, it's this meta pattern, right? You have okay, well, religion is this problem, therefore we need to create something new. Therefore, government will be God. We can't entirely escape the religious lingo and religious rituals and religious symbolism. So we build temples to Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and all these people, Thomas Jefferson, and then we, end up revolting against those gods as well as they just as they overthrew God. Now we're overthrowing them because Jefferson's a racist, Washington's a racist, Abraham Lincoln, well, he's got all sorts of problems, but we can talk about that later. Right. And then what does the government now do? Well, so now they go down one level and they're like, okay, well, now we can insert ourselves into these communities and then we can replace the fathers, right? The actual fathers by, well, welfare checks, right? So the fathers check out. So this is the thing they've done. They've destroyed things. They've tried to destroy that which is above. Ultimately, you can't do that. And they now are in the process of, because of that, right? That seeps down into what's beneath them, and then it leaches into the communities, and now the communities are being utterly um, obliterated.
So
It's a scary system.
so yeah, basically the state tries to become God, which ipso facto, prima facie, uh, is impossible. So it's
Yeah,
gonna collapse. Basically,
yeah,
is
it's gonna.
like
Well, what is a
necessarily
nation
it
anyway,
cannot
right?
work. Go on,
Yeah,
Graham.
Like a nation is a machine of subsidiarity, is what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to give you something proportionate to what you give it, right? And so there was this quote from JFK, and it was like, or I'm pretty sure it was JFK. I'm a terrible civic citizen, but
Yeah, it
um,
was. I know what you're gonna say. It was JFK. Go on.
yeah, it's ask not what your nation can do for you, but what you can do for your nation, right? And that's a great quote relative to the state of the country now.
He actually
But what
just
it should
for the
actually,
for sorry to interrupt you, just for the because these words do matter. I think he said country and not nation, but go on.
well, did he say country or did he say nation?
Pretty certain
The
he said
distinction is
country.
important, but in this case, he's talking about the U.S.
Yeah,
yeah,
go
Ask
on.
not what you can do for the U.S. or what the U.S. can do for you, but what you can do for it. But in an ideal world, it's ask what you can do for it and it for you. It's not you don't have to choose. You shouldn't have to choose one, right? And that's why people used to go and die for their nation. They thought it was something sacred because it represented the people, right? But now it doesn't really represent the people. It represents a monolith that the people are submitting to, right? And it's like Philip was saying, it's made itself a God that we submit to, but this God isn't delivering us, anything godly, right? Godly things deliver us peace, and they deliver us something like almost untouchable. But we see what the nation is doing, and we watch the news, and we do all these things, and imagine if you had a live stream into the mind of God, right? Your head would explode and it would just be splat everywhere. And you're not supposed to understand something that's truly sacred. And so when we make nations into something that like sacred, we're losing a little bit of what God is supposed to actually be.
yeah.
So Philip, go on. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So once again, it comes down to the difference between being ordained and appointed by God and participating in that and completely replacing him. People think it's the same thing. It's like, oh, right of kings to rule, right? It's like there's a subtle difference there because the king always had the mind, the identity of the nation, which was usually its religious functions, because civic and religious functions weren't really all that different in up until the Industrial Revolution, really the Protestant Revolution, right? All of these things were tied together. But that's the huge difference. It's the difference between being appointed by God and carrying those principles down and fulfilling those duties, and replacing God with something that's not God.
I don't know if we can kind of riff on this for a second, but I remember thinking, it occurred to me one time, you know the way priests, I know you guys are now Orthodox and all, but people think of a Catholic priest, and presumably an Orthodox one dressed in his clericals. Do you use the same terminology? Or what do you
Yeah,
call that?
sure.
So
Yeah,
back in the
clerics.
day,
Yeah.
back in the
Cat.
day, back in the day, the lads were wearing the cassock, right? And you see a man wearing a cassock, and he's walking down the street, and you're like, oh my goodness, like this is you literally see him, and you think this is out of this world or whatever, in a sense. And that's kind of the whole point. It's like this guy is ordained as he's not a god, obviously, but He's not a normal person. And so the priest, and then you've like, well, priests don't wear the clericals anymore. And we don't really respect the priests anyway, because as knowledge becomes more, uh, sorry, I'm a bit slow because I'm just tired. But anyway, as knowledge becomes more accessible to everyone, that's certain things aren't reserved to the priest that used to be. Where you guys can talk more about this, I'm sure, but priests used to basically be the only people who were quote educated, or the only people who could read the Bible or whatever. So it's like by definition they are in this elite priest class, right? But now it's like, well, everyone can learn about everything if they want. So why is the priest special? Aside from the religious convictions of people, right? So then COVID comes along, and it's like we still have these archetypes in our head of priest, like it's a deep role, and then other people became the priest. Obviously, in a kind of a they were actual priests, but it was like Tony Fauci was like the head priest or whatever, like he was this kind of all-knowing, or kind and people talk about trusting the expert, but basically I had this like expert now as priest, and it's like whenever there's anything being discussed, it's like, well, we're going to get this person who's an expert in this thing, person who has a PhD in this thing, and those are our priests. I don't know. Do you guys have anything to say on that? It just really it really became clear in COVID, and it's kind of like Philip. You're saying we replace God with government. You could say you replace religion with science or whatever, and then you replace the priest with an expert.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the thing is you cannot entirely escape myths and stories, right? There's not like okay, it's like I'm a simple medieval peasant. The priest, tells me, whatever story he tells me about the Feast of the Dormition, right? The Theotokos is, learns from the angel Gabriel, and she delivered a palm. 3 days later she's going to die. The apostles come, they sing hymns. Christ comes, she dies. He takes her soul with him to heaven, and then they're doing a funeral procession, and a wicked Jew comes up, and the Archangel Michael comes and cuts off his hands. He repents, he's restored, becomes a Christian, and her body's taken up as well. It's like, okay, well, from a scientific perspective or whatever, that sounds absolutely ridiculous. But why do I believe it? Because somebody from above has told me that that's true. Somebody who I trust has told me that that's true, and I see the fruits of these things, right? I see the patterns of these things. That's how I know it's true. Well, the same thing can be applied to the science, like you said, or really anything, right? It's like the football. It could be the football coach. It could be the referee. It could be, well, he's an expert in these rules, so of course you have to listen to him. Right? People are still going to cry foul when their team doesn't win, but why do you believe these people? Right? There's no difference between the priest telling you this story and the scientist in the lab coat who has sort of this hidden, unaccessible knowledge to you. I don't have access to microscopes and telescopes and all these other fancy schmancy equipment. What is my belief in whatever scientific thing based on? Well, it's based on whatever the guy tells me, right? So you can try and take these things and pretend that religion is just this silly dress up thing that everyone does, right? It's like, well, why does the scientist have to wear a damn lab coat? He doesn't have to, technically. He can wear clown pants, right? In a Frosty the Snowman hat, but he doesn't because there's a ritual involved, right? They were the priests, they wear those funny hats. It's like, yeah, well, he's wearing this silly white coat. What's the difference? There's not much of a difference, right? And this is why like reductionism doesn't work. So it doesn't work because ultimately you can just reduce everything down to its parts. But there's more than just like, oh, guy in white lab coat looks under microscope, ha 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 ha. Right? I can reduce science to that if I want to. That doesn't make it true. And I think that's the thing. You can't get away from myth because that's how we structure our lives.
And I just want to clarify. Obviously, I'm not saying that. To go that saying, I'm not saying the priest is the only person allowed to be an expert. Obviously, we respect competence in respective domains where appropriate, but there's something like you're saying, this hidden knowledge that like I don't have the right to question or whatever. And there's something, yeah, there's something untouchable about the priest, which I think we associate with the whole experts in science and things like that. Graham, do you have anything to say about any of that?
Yeah, I think people are really quick to ridicule the priest and to ridicule religion because that's exactly where the stakes are highest. I mean, that's where the stakes people want to have the most control over the place where stakes are highest. And what we're seeing with people in lab coats, judges in uniforms, freaking whatever you guys have over there in the aisles with the wigs or whatever, like that's competence, ritual, and authority all look the same across the board, just in different ways. There's always going to be uniforms, there's always going to be titles, and there's always going to be someone who knows more than someone else. And the stakes are highest in religion, and that's why people kind of hate it these days. But they're very quick to participate in other things that are quasi-religious, right? This is a callback to my old fraternal order, quasi-religious forms, right? If it weren't for the fact that most of the people were kooky, this would be in public conversation. But the kookers back in 2020 were calling masks and freaking like the face shields, sacramentals, and the vaccine was called a sacrament, right? And because they intuitively understood that you can't escape myth, like Philip said, it is everywhere. And just like the nap is a ritual. It's a type of laying down and dying, right? The bed is a sort of altar, right? You prepare the altar before the liturgy. You make up your bed, you get your bed ready before you lie down on it and die. And that's exactly what's going on in liturgy. You make up the altar, and then you put the host on, you consecrate it, and that's death. And then the consummation is the receiving of the sacrament, and you technically you receive the sacrament of sleeping when you wake up. And it's the same thing with the vaccination, right? There's an insertion and then there's a result. It's a sacrifice. That's what I think
Um,
about
Now, Graham, why do you say because the stakes are highest, that's why we ridicule it? Why why is that? Why does that follow?
well, ridicule. I think the ridicule actually proceeds from the fact that we know we can't control it, right? We feel like there's no participating in it. It's kind of like the thing with government, right? That's why we ridicule the national government, is because we feel like that's the thing we really should be able to participate fully in, but we can't give it our all. It's just too distant. And for many people, religion is just too distant.
Okay.
So the stakes are high, it's too far away, and that's a good recipe for ridiculing something, right? Just like a nerd in school, you know he's smarter than you, and you know he's worlds away from you in terms of what he's interested in. So you just make fun of the guy. It's the same thing. Strange
It's
things
funny.
will be tested against incorporation, just like immigrants. Some will assimilate, some will not, and that's a protection mechanism. But the problem these days is that we've given people too much knowledge, right? So the protection mechanism against religion has failed because there should be a distance between the common plebs on the normal curve and people who know more and just objectively are better, right? That's why education is important. Priests are more educated for a reason. They should know more about that. So should a scientist. He should know more about health than, or about what, let's say a doctor. He should know more about health than you. And the minute we start trying to breach that sacred space between expert and non, that's whenever we start ridiculing something.